Thanks, Donal. Good morning, everybody. I work with the Wheel as Director of Advocacy, and the Wheel is a support and representative organisation for Ireland's charities and voluntary and community organisations. We have over 900 member organisations now, and that's about 12% of all of Ireland's, would you believe it, 8,000 charitable organisations. We have a lot of charities in Ireland. We've learned a lot about what needs fixing in this world from our members, and I'd like to share some of that learning with you today. Our Western consumerist way has bought us so many good things that we've forgotten that the production and consumption system that brings these great benefits to many of us is unsustainable in terms of energy consumption, natural resource depletion, pollution, and the human suffering and exposure to vulnerability that it causes for many people in the world, including here in Ireland. We are overproducing and overconsuming, with terrible consequences for many people now and into the future. And the production system wants us to keep on thinking we need all this overconsumption, because it's in its interests for us to think that, so we keep on overconsuming. This Western consumerist way also produces very high levels of ill health and dysfunctionality in Ireland and the world. Think of the levels of depressive illness, obesity, and addictive behaviour in our society, and how we've normalised these behaviours and experiences, and built up, indeed, whole industries in their maintenance and management and further nurturing. Think of the investment of the pharmaceutical firms in maintaining high levels of depressive illness, for example. Think of the levels of inequality that we've become inured to and that many of our contributors this morning have referenced, and the poverty in which many people live in a country with the wealth of Ireland. We're not a poor country. We know that 16% of Ireland's population right now live at risk of poverty, with incomes below €11,140 for a single person or €25,000 for a family of four. Think of the consequences of our way of living for the poorest people of the world and the massive toll on the environment and on biodiversity at a global level. And we haven't talked about the environment really at MacGill so far this week. We're living through a mass extinction, would you believe it? Which most people, in my experience, are completely unaware of. Over 500,000 species, I was astonished to learn, have become extinct since the year 2000. That's just a mind-boggling number when you think about it. Is all of this really normal? Is it inevitable that the world has to be so? I suggest it's not. These pathological outcomes are produced by the way our society and economy are organised. Plainly put, our Western way puts the interests of wealth and the economic system that serves the interests of wealth above that of meeting everybody's needs as a priority. That's the way we have structured our affairs. And wealth is now so powerful, indeed, that we face nothing less than a crisis of sovereignty in Ireland, Europe, and the world. What can be done? What can we do in Ireland, and what can we here in this room begin to do today to shape the future of the world in the way that we'd like it to be? In this contribution, I'm going to argue that we need to do four interrelated goals for ourselves if we really want to protect citizens and create an Ireland in a world of justice and fairness. Firstly, we should set the meeting of people's needs as our top political priority by endowing citizens with economic, social and cultural rights. Secondly, we must invest communities with real power to shape their futures, reclaim sovereignty and hold power to account. Thirdly, we must develop a framework for sustainable living that supports and is connected into global initiatives for a sustainable world. And fourthly, we need to accept our human vulnerabilities and our interdependence. Stop trying to escape from them in a fruitless, never-ending quest for consumerist comfort, and instead commit to sharing the risks and costs of our human vulnerabilities fairly with each other. If we do these four things, then not only will we enable people to live with human vulnerability, but we will ensure a flourishing and sustainable future for ourselves, our communities and the planet itself. Let's begin by looking at the first goal, making the meeting of people's needs our top political priority. Why is it that when it comes to providing for people's needs through services and income supports, that the mantra is always that of affordability, even in a country like Ireland that still has one of the lowest tax takes in the European Union as a percentage of GDP. Our tax take is around 31% of GDP versus a European average of 35.6%, and we think we're heavily taxed. We close off debate about what we need by immediately engaging in a debate about what we can afford, which is really a disguised debate about who pays how much for public services and whether they should be paid for at all from some stakeholders' perspectives. I think that the preeminence of the economic over the political is causing this closure to possibility in relation to what's possible for us in our futures. I understand economics, I've studied it, and I have an appreciation for the very important role it plays in today's complex, interconnected economic world. But economics is the wrong discourse to be leading the debate and controlling the language about what's possible in Ireland. But that is exactly what's happening today and what has been happening for years. Economics is a contested discipline, which is unfortunately understood by many in the public and by many economists themselves as being an objective science. It's nothing of the sort. It's a hugely political art, the practice of which is always in the service of an ideological view, and the interests that are served by whatever that ideology happens to be. And the current dominant neoliberal economic paradigm is clearly serving the interests of global wealth. I believe that economic discourse in the service of global wealth is replacing political discourse. And that's at the root of the crisis of sovereignty we are currently experiencing. Economists in the audience will not like my characterization, but I suggest that the profession of the economist is better understood as analogous to that of the quantity surveyor in the world of construction. And the proper function of the quantity surveyor is to advise the architect on how to build a building once the design has been set. Instead of performing the role of providing advice about how the building should be constructed after it has been designed, we have allowed economics to dominate political discourse to such an extent that the building of the nation and the state is now being designed by economist quantity surveyors with no architectural, if you will, political vision of what's possible. Many of whom also happen to be, unbeknownst to themselves, shaping the building of our future in the interests of global wealth, in actual fact. I believe that the language of politics itself has been effectively colonized and dominated by the language of economics. Because political discourse has been colonized in this way by economic and neoliberal economic ideas, open conversations about what's possible for us in our future that should be taking place in our political discourse are now happening primarily, in fact, in civil society spaces. And it's into the leadership from these places and into these conversations that we need to reconnect mainstream politics. We need to restore primacy to politics, and in doing this, restore sovereignty to the people. Civil society needs to reconnect with politics, to re-establish the language of the possible in political discourse, and reclaim the space currently occupied and dominated by the restricting language of economics. Then we will have a politics of the possible, rather than the politics of the impossible, which we seem to currently have. If we think in terms of a politics of the possible, then of course we can have the best public health and social services in the world if we want them. It just means sharing more of our private wealth with each other through the tax system. We need to appreciate more fully that it is through the tax system that we practically express our social solidarity with one another. We heard about Denmark's amazing experience yesterday. What this comes down to, plain and simple, is whether we want everyone to have access to quality public services paid for through general taxation, or for some people to have access to quality public services, while those who can't pay are left reliant on insufficiently funded public services that manifest, as we all know, in long waiting lists and cutbacks that affect the quality of those services. This approach, which is our current approach, then goes on to create a resentment on the part of those who pay privately to continue paying their taxes to fund services that they think they do not use. But of course they use them, because the private system is heavily subsidized in actual fact by the public system. All of this breaks the bonds of social solidarity that a commitment to universal public services maintain. Again, look at Denmark for a vision of what's possible, where all parties support the universal approach to providing comprehensive public services. Our approach leads to the creation of a divided society between the private and the public domains, with a general impression by the private that public services are inferior and for the vulnerable only. Do we want universal, high-quality health and social services? We can have them if we want them. We must commit to raising sufficient taxes to pay for the public services that people need and should have as a right by bringing Ireland's tax take up to the European average. We should decide first what public services people should have access to as a right, and then agree how we're going to pay for them. One way to ensure this happens would be to incorporate a full suite of economic, social and cultural rights in the Constitution, perhaps in the form of a Bill of Rights. Economic, social and cultural rights are fundamental human rights and include the rights to work, to social security, to an adequate standard of living, including food, clothing and housing, to physical and mental health, to education, and to take part in cultural life. On the face of it, these rights already exist, as our government has committed to them by ratifying the International Covenant of Economic, Social and Cultural Rights in 1989. However, the Covenant has never been given legal effect in Irish law, so people cannot vindicate their rights. We have the rights in one way, and at the same time we do not have the rights. It's time now to ensure these rights are made legally enforceable. How else can we create a flourishing society that meets people's needs? The work of Eric Olin Wright, an American sociologist, points the way to some practical things we can do to create flourishing societies. He argues that 4 moral principles are required for a flourishing society. The equality principle means that all people should have equal access to the social conditions and materials necessary to lead a flourishing life. The democracy principle means all people should have equal access to means of participating in making decisions that affect them. The principle of sustainability means future generations should be able to flourish at least as well as present generations. And the principle of reciprocity means that we should all value cooperation as strongly as we do competition and individualism. So how are we doing in Ireland when we measure our society in terms of these principles? I think we'd have to say poorly in relation to equality, democracy and sustainability. But not so bad, perhaps, I think, in relation to reciprocity, a strength in Ireland on which I believe we can build in relation to the other 3. Olin Wright argues that consumerism is not a universalizable form of human flourishing. If we stick with consumerism, he argues, we will never see human flourishing, where all people can realize their potential. But he points to examples of what he calls real utopias, an interesting idea, that currently exist in the world, which prove that progress can be made towards creating flourishing societies. And examples he gives of these real utopias are eco-villages, for example. Wikipedia, a public space. All of these are places that put the shared interest above the private interest. Public libraries, credit unions and social finance, worker cooperatives, recent urban agricultural movements and community land trusts, and policy juries where people participate in making decisions that affect them. Examples of all of these initiatives exist in the world, and many exist in Ireland, and provide models for what's possible in creating sustainable, flourishing communities of cooperation. Let's turn quickly to our second goal, invest in communities with the power to shape their futures and hold power to account. The representative system has failed us, we've heard many times this week. A consultation held in late June by civil society as part of producing Ireland's first open government programme diagnosed what's preventing people from participating in making the decisions that affect them. There was a general consensus that we need to make the representative system more connected and sensitive to the views and needs and priorities of communities. We have a representative system. It's the legitimate system in relation to voters and accountability, and it understands itself to have that role. So we as civil society must work with it to improve its own sensitivity. We need to create powerful places and spaces that complement the representative system, where people can actively participate in making decisions that affect them and in holding representative power to account. The way government perceives participation was seen as being a problem. Are we allowed to participate as subjects, or do we have the right to participate as citizens in making decisions? Accountability to electorates is generally seen by the elected as trumping the participative forms of involvement and is seen as being more legitimate. We need to accept that as citizens, we have both a right and an obligation to participate in decision-making. We've become used to top-down decision-making in a prevailing citizen-on-the-sideline culture, summed up poetically as the delusion of the elected and the collusion of the electorate. A culture of institutional, governmental and ministerial unchallengeability is thought to prevail. We need much more representative We need much more diversity in our representative system. And we heard all about Niamh Gallagher's project yesterday with regard to ensuring equal numbers of women in politics. And we need education in critical and creative thinking at all levels, and to address the citizenship, the deficiency in citizenship education. In a sense, there's a learned helplessness, I think, that we've allowed ourselves to fall into. And we need to unlearn our way out and relearn our way out of this learned helplessness. Let's have a very quick look at a third element of what's needed, a global framework for sustainable living. We've identified that Ireland cannot solve its own problems thinking insularly. To be looking at Irish problems in the absence of a European and global context is not to understand the gravity of the challenges that face us as human beings in the world. Achieving sustainability means rethinking the way we think about things. Instead of thinking of the society serving the economy and the economy externalizing its waste into the environment, we need to redefine the framework so that it includes the environment tended by society and served by sustainable economic activity. And that means changing our own individual behaviour. The Wheel, in association with DOCUS, which is Ireland's national umbrella organisation for NGOs that work in overseas in developing countries, and Claiming Our Future, a citizens movement, implemented a campaign to develop a vision for the United Nations Millennium Development Goals, which are going to expire in 2015. And people at the event identified these 5 things as characterising the world that they wanted to live in. People wanted to live in a world of equality, a world of responsive, inclusive and accountable governance, a world of environmental and social sustainability, a world where human rights exist and are vindicated, and a world characterised by a non-exploitative economy. Why is it that we don't see any of these goals prioritised in our mainstream political discourse? Could it be that they are all incompatible with the neoliberal economic discourse in the service of which our politics are currently dominated? Finally, and to conclude, I would just like to reflect for a moment on the theme of this morning's session, vulnerability and weakness, and what we mean by that. Because we tend to think of vulnerability as though there's a category of vulnerable people who are somehow different from everybody else and who require special treatment in some sort of potentially burdensome, costly way. We are all vulnerable, but some of us are more vulnerable than others, and some of us are able to insulate ourselves against the consequences of our vulnerability because of money and wealth, while others cannot and are sometimes viewed as a burden by those who can insulate themselves. I think we can better understand vulnerability if we look at the definition of the word. Vulnerability is defined as the openness to being wounded. Weakness is defined as lacking strength or being easily overcome. The opposites of weakness and vulnerability are strength and invulnerability. No one wishes to be weak and vulnerable. Some people wish to be strong and invulnerable, but most people, in my experience, wish to be somewhere in between, not denying and seeking to eliminate their human vulnerabilities, but recognizing and sharing responsibility for protecting themselves and others from the consequences of the realities of being human. Understanding vulnerability in this way, the openness to being wounded, also opens up the opportunity to reflect on our attitudes to being open to vulnerability in ourselves, our attitudes to sharing responsibility for ensuring that others are protected from the consequences of their vulnerabilities, and avoiding seeking to escape our own vulnerabilities at the expense of others. The opposite and prevailing view of vulnerability as a weakness promotes an extreme self-reliance and an avoidance of responsibility for others as a social norm to be aspired to. The negative consequences of this stance go on to expose those who cannot protect themselves to exploitation and to neglect. We need to change our attitudes to exploitation and to sharing responsibility. Our inspiration should be to create a world where vulnerable people don't need special protection anymore because the exploitation of weakness in others is no longer acceptable, and that includes in the world of business. Our inspiration should be to create a world where people have rights, to have their needs met through a combination of high-quality public services and guaranteed basic income. without having to appeal to other people's voluntary generosity or charity, as it is sometimes called. It is possible if enough of us want it to be, if we can think about again what's possible. And if we can overcome the powerful interests that profit from keeping things the way they are now. The Wheel is intending to explore issues of human vulnerability in a series of national conversations we will initiate soon. We believe that a sustained national conversation is necessary around the question, what is shaping our future? We believe that the shaping forces of our lives are in very many cases detrimental to our developing, fully flourishing human living together. Many people feel that amongst these negative forces are economism, the seeing of all domains through a restricted economic cost-benefit lens and not seeing what's possible for us as a result. Consumerism, the erosion of public spaces for civic culture, private interests trumping the public good, a loss of faith, a word that's hardly ever mentioned anymore, both in transcendent meaning and in the capacity for positive human development. The profound skepticism which prevails in Western culture about how we might believe in the human capacity to love and serve others. Future conversations will need to explore these and other shaping forces and the evidence of their influence on the dysfunctional society we have or are becoming. We might then, having a shared analysis, explore together the antidotes that might be brought to bear effectively to address these challenges. We have resources in philosophy, in sociology, in political theory, and in religious and spiritual thought, and experience as well in reforming the discipline of economics, to develop new narratives and develop new experiments in living for this conversation and for the changing world that we need to actively create for ourselves. I would like to conclude by inviting everyone here today to participate in conversations like this when they're initiated, and which we hope to sustain, and which I suggest, if we sustain and act upon, conversations like this will enable us to achieve the 4 goals proposed earlier for a world where meeting people's needs is the top political priority, where communities shape their own futures and hold power to account, where the environment is sustained for ourselves and for future generations, and where the costs of our human vulnerabilities are shared between us. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ivan. Now we